grab your hat and Fowler. The regulars are coming. Get to Lexington.
On the morning of April 19th, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith of the British Army led a column of around 700 British troops out of the city of Boston. His intent was to try to seize arms, ammunition, and supplies that had been stockpiled by American militias at the town of Concord. The American militias are warned ahead of time of the attack, and as a result, they mass their formations and prepare to encounter the British. This has happened several times before. The British had made patrols and efforts to move out of the city. The Americans were increasingly on edge and considering the possibility of revolution. But it hadn't yet opened up and fought, and no fighting had occurred yet in the open. However, British column is going to get their first taste of battle here in North America. Now, the British Army, as it marches out, didn't intend in the morning of that day to actually fight the Americans. Their initial intent was just to try to take those supplies and destroy them and try to cripple the revolution before it even starts. The initial expectation for the Americans at the time wasn't to go to battle either. They had formed up in response to British movement and occupation many times before, and many considered this not to be too much different. However, General Gage, the commander of the Boston garrison, had received orders on April 14th that the colony was considered to be in rebellion and that he was to go and seize these arms equipment and to put down the beginnings of this rebellion. The Americans had already organized the Second Continental Congress, which was already tasked with trying to negotiate a solution to the issues the Americans had, but they were considering the possibility of armed insurrection. And with this powder keg set up, the Battle of Lexington and Concord was on. Now, the British column was advancing down the road, and through, as they were trying to reach Concord, they would have had to pass through the town of Lexington. The local militias had all been warned ahead of time and had started to assemble, and had actually assembled quickly enough that they were actually almost ready to disband by the time the British column does arrive. Now, the British column arrived in Lexington around 5 a.m. So it was very early in the morning. These soldiers, these men rather, had been coming out of their towns, out of the farms, out of the areas around Lexington, and had assembled at the local tavern. And Colonel Parker, who was in charge of their forces, had gotten them together, and when the British were identified as having come up the road and were arriving in the town, he had his men assemble on the town green. Now, at the town green, the British column, instead of marching past the green and continuing along the road to Concord, decided to confront these local militias and order them to disband. Unfortunately for both sides, or fortunately depending on your perspective in history, the American forces and the British forces came to blows. No one's exactly sure who fired the shot heard around the world, but the Americans and the British opened up on each other, with the British getting the upper hand and the American militias being forced to disperse and flee into the woods. The British column, having successfully done this, continued on its march, but it did inflict casualties on those Americans that were located at Lexington and had suffered some on their own. But the column continued its march to Concord, its plan still in action. They arrived in Concord around 9 a.m. So early in the morning, they're arriving in the town and they're starting to look for the rumored supplies that they had expected to find. Many of them had been hidden or moved or otherwise kept out of British reach. However, the British did manage to find a couple of artillery pieces the Americans had kept at Concord, and they were able to destroy those artillery pieces and their associated artillery carriages, as well as a few smaller stores of ammunition that local loyalist spies had managed to reveal to the reveal to the British. As a result, the British were able to conduct some destruction of the areas There was a fire that started in town as the British were doing their searching. They did help to put it out, though, and ultimately the British were ordered not to commit undue acts against the population. They were under orders to try to be as civil in the process of handling this as they could. General Gage, at this point, while he understood the possibility of insurrection, was not wanting to provoke it if he could avoid it. But shots had already been fired, and more were to come. At Concord, the British Army sent detachments to the north and south bridges to secure their flanks and to ensure that they weren't going to be encircled and attacked from other directions. In the process of sending the men to these areas, the American militia had moved away from the town and set up outside of the town above the North Bridge. As the British, though, were conducting their destruction in the city, and as many fires were seen from the destruction that was being conducted, the American militias had had enough. They had mustered large numbers of people from nearby towns, and now their militias were in very large numbers in comparison to what they had been previously. About 400 American militia start to march down along towards the North Bridge. And the British light infantry detachment that had been sent to defend that bridge was woefully under-equipped and unprepared to deal with this large force of Americans. And as the Americans approached the bridge, they got very close to the British, who then opened up on the Americans. Unfortunately for those light infantry, they did not have the firepower to match the larger American force, who then responded and inflict high casualties on those light infantrymen. The British were forced back into Concord, but the Americans withdrew as well, not wanting to further increase the bloodshed. However, at this point, the battle had started. The British do finish their occupation of Concord, wrap up what they were doing, and start their march back. But as they start their march back, the American militias start to pursue, as well as local militias that had assembled on the road on the way back to Boston and who would meet them as they were coming down the road. The British started to be harried from multiple directions, being attacked from troops that had hidden in the woods, as well as formations of American militias that come out of the woods, engage them temporarily, and then are driven back. But this constant fighting over the 16 miles back to Boston, or at least the threat of that, started to really cause panic among the British soldiers. Now, these British soldiers were well trained, but they had not yet tasted battle, and this was their first taste, and many of them didn't hold up very well to it. According to many of the British officers at the time, they record that their men often broke formation and in many cases started to flee as they started to run out of ammunition, since they had been constantly in combat with the Americans since they had left the town of Concord. The British forces make it back to Lexington, and at that point, they're at the risk of falling apart entirely. British officers had run ahead of the men to try to force them to stop in order to keep them in formations and keep them together. Unfortunately for the British, there had been supposed to be a relief column that was supposed to come and assist this initial column and allow them to have the resources they needed to withdraw efficiently, but that relief column was delayed. Hugh Percy, the Duke of Northumberland, was leading that section, and they did arrive at the nick of time at Lexington. Now, this reinforcements of additional troops helped bolster the spirits of the British troops, but the arrival of a pair of 6-pounders, the British Army, definitely did a lot to help the British forces. This artillery, unlike the musketry that the British had been using up to that point, was completely outclassing the American firearms. And with the artillery support, they were able to cause enough fear and enough trepidation among the American soldiers to force them back and ultimately secure the retreat from Lexington and Concord. The British Army returned to Boston. However, hot on their heels were a few thousand American militia from places like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and many other New England states. They massed around the city of Boston and led, ultimately, to the siege of Boston. Now, the battle itself, there were about 1,500 British troops ultimately engaged as part of the battle. The Americans had about 3,900, about 3,900 men. The casualties were definitely in the favor of the Americans, although it's really not very good no matter what you look at it. The fact is, the British lost about 73 men dead. About 174 were wounded, and about 26 were missing, for a total casualty listing of 273. The colonial militias suffered about 49 dead, 41 wounded, and 5 missing, for a total of 96 total casualties. So compared to the British, they suffered far less. However, the British column did manage to make it back to Boston and did successfully return. Ultimately, though, while the British achieved their major objective and were able to safely make it back to Boston, this really turns out to be a pretty significant American victory. For one, the British managed to fail in their ultimate objective of not provoking the colonies and still trying to disarm them. And so as a result, the British were forced into a conflict that they were not prepared for. General Gage ultimately was surrounded at Boston by large numbers of militia. The Americans then declared that local militia to be part of the Continental Army on June 14, 1775, the formation of the U.S. Army. And so this led directly to the capture of Boston, the loss of General Gage there, and ultimately to the start of the American Revolution that led to the end of British occupation in North America, in this part of North America at least. And there are some other things that are also kind of interesting to note, specifically for us here at Yorktown, when it comes to the fighting at Lexington and Concord, and that is the fact that British units at the Battle of Concord, Lexington and Concord, specifically the 23rd Regiment of Foot, which was the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, fought also here at Yorktown. And in fact, their main position is across the road from our museum at the Welsh Fusilier Redoubt.
Thanks for watching, everybody. We hope you enjoyed that. We're going to start a series now talking about major events during the American Revolution, particularly from the military perspective, and how they influenced the Army and how it influenced the outcome of the war. So I hope you guys stay tuned for that. Please like and subscribe, and leave us a comment if there's anything you found particularly interesting about the video. If there was any questions you had about the battle, just leave those and let us know. Thanks for coming out and seeing us. Have a good day. Grab your hat and Fowler. The regulars are coming. Get to Boston. Boston. Lexington. 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 Or Boston. Actually, Boston would be safer, you think? Yeah. All right.
You guys go to Boston.
You guys go to Boston.
I'm going to Boston.
I'm gonna besiege the city by myself.
Right, yeah.
On the morning of April 17th, let's start with the wrong day.
On the morning of April 17th, nothing
On the
happened.
17th, nothing happened.
Nothing happened.
Everyone was all right. Life was good for most people.